final part of the morning, this morning, I'm going to quiz the three of our lovely panellists on some of the key themes that have come up. Before I do, it's worth saying that we are in the process of developing a tool that will actually allow brands to input answers to those 4 pillar questions that was spoken about earlier, and calculate their own trust score. So look at what their score is across each of those 4 pillars: fame, familiarity, competence and risk. And then it'll kick out a trust score at the end. And you'll also be able to see what your average is versus those 150 brands that we've already tracked. So that is coming around mid-April, so look out for it. We'll be talking about it then. But to the questions. Okay. So I've got loads of questions. I'm going to throw some questions out to the floor, so have a little think about what you might want to ask our panellists shortly. But Kelly, I'm going to start with you. We've talked a lot about trust. Obviously, trust in advertising is also a critical issue at the minute, and remains a hot topic in the industry. What do you think's driving this low level of trust within the advertising industry?
I actually think it's a really interesting concept that there's a kind of crisis in trust in advertising. I think there's a bit of misinformation around it, but actually, as we've seen from my esteemed peers here today, who I feel very humble to be around, it's really multidimensional kind of concept, trust, and I think we need to look at it in terms of the detail around effectiveness. And I think there's definitely a distrust in brands, in corporations, in industries, definitely in politics and leadership. But actually, when we look at kind of effectiveness on categories and brands from an advertising perspective, actually the kind of impact of advertising on channels, when we look at categories, ROIs are pretty consistent or up. And I think a lot of the effectiveness crisis is often in short-termism, or is in the depth of, which channels you're using, or the craft underneath those channels that is maybe driving this thought that advertising isn't working as strong as it was working. I mean, there's definitely a need for more trust because we've seen the impact of it today, right? But I'm not sure there's a distrust in advertising in the way that we think there is, or that we're not seeing it in our data anyway from a client perspective.
Yeah, that's interesting. And Peter, if there is a collective ambition in the industry, I suppose, to improve our position and strengthen public trust in advertising, what do you think advertisers should be doing?
Well, the first thing is, and I think one of the reasons trust has become such a big issue, is a legacy of a decade of kind of just not doing enough to support brands. So just to echo exactly what Kay's just said, if you don't give people reasons to trust your brands, why on earth can you expect it? I mean, they don't earn it without that. So I think one of the reasons it's become such an important thing is just the absence of adequate brand support over a long period of time. So the first thing is to lean back into that, which hopefully, COVID aside, we were beginning to do and maybe will in the future. But of course, there are other issues. There are reasons why people are beginning to ask questions of brands and businesses. It obviously depends on the consumer. Some people are very worried about ESG, and for some brands, that is clearly more of a sensitive area than others. So trust might well, in those instances, be remedied by, again, leaning into communicating what you're doing, environmentally or whatever. And there are other reasons. I mean, I've talked a little bit about the environment in which you advertise. Clearly there are big questions related to whatever you read in social media. So if you're relying entirely on that for your kind of brand impact, then it's going to be difficult to land those points. So, as always, I think it's about good, rich, mixed schedules where you're taking strengths of each of the channels, compensating for weaknesses, with others. So, as always, don't put your eggs in one basket and be aware of the issue.
Yeah, good old media planning, I think, comes to the fore. The craft of media planning is incredibly important.
Isn't that a nice thing to hear talked
Isn't
about,
it?
Isn't it? Let's not put it all in some kind of AI programmatic, because these issues are, we know context is important. We know that seeing ads in particular context, if you can play the good old-fashioned media planning rules of spotting very, very rich environments where some relevant issues being discussed, you can make a much bigger impact. And those things are often human judgments, I would say.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is we sort of have this like burst of everyone talking about finding context, and actually we were doing great context 10, 15 years ago. I'd argue possibly better use of context in broadcast channels than maybe we are doing now, and it was great at building brands, and your data showed that earlier, Peter, and then we had the crisis, and we're picking back up. But to build a brand, the environment that brand is showing up in, as we've seen today, is incredibly important.
Just to come in on that point, I mean, it was one of the striking findings from the research, talking to people about the context that they see these brands in. It seems like that sort of programmatic, cookie-driven advertising, those ads that follow you around every site you go to, is eroding the ability for the context to confer trust on those ads, because people realise it's like, oh, this is appearing to me because of something I've done, not because of something to do with this site or the sort of, so that kind of native advertising that feels like it is much more in keeping, in tune with the environment in which it's it's placed, allows you to get those effects. If we're just using the consumer as the sort of center of gravity for all these things, it's shorn of the contextual effects that we could really enjoy the benefits from.
Yeah, I feel like the where of media planning has almost got lost over the past sort of 10 years.
Bring it back.
And we do need to bring it back. I wholeheartedly agree. Andy, shifting tact a little bit, what are the factors, in your view, that influence consumer decisions to trust brands, and how does trust influence consumer behaviour and purchase decisions?
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, I would say it's not what we think it is, and actually trusting a brand is the ability to not think about it. So if you think about your own lives, the things you trust are the things that you never think about. And it's actually when something happens to one of those trusted things, whether it's a partner or whether it's your car or whatever it is that you've just come to automatically rely on, it's when something surprises you and goes wrong with it that suddenly, it grabs a ton of your attention. So, for brands, it's that sort of funny thing that we want to feel like we're trying to sort of engage people, but we really don't want to be engaging their sort of system to mind. We want them just to sort of automatically, subconsciously let their sort of autopilot be making the decisions. And trust allows you to do that. You feel like this is familiar, you feel like other people back it, you feel like it's competent, and it's a relatively risk-free thing to do. You don't think about it, and then you buy it.
I think, Niki, just to build on that, like we talked about this the other day, like brands are consumed kind of in a wide social ecosystem, and they're used as a kind of ability to shortcut decisions, right, to the point on familiarity and reliability and all of those things. I think, with the advent of lots and lots of ways of doing things like personalization, and there are places where that is absolutely relevant, but this kind of rush to one-to-one has sort of forgotten the fact that big public broadcast spaces, and we've seen it again today, TV, news brands, where your content and context is very reliable and trusted, it plays a massive part in brand growth. And I think that, like, reminding ourselves of that, and research like this does that, is incredibly important.
Yeah, I suppose it's about just having a clear definition of the role of the different media channels within a broader plan. I think we would always say that, obviously multimedia campaign is the best way to go. We'd never say news brand is all, it's all about news brands, but they do still have a really key part to play as part of that plan. Peter, we talked about, and we saw in your research, that media choices can really influence brand trust. From your experience of working with brands over the years, to what extent do you think agencies and advertisers are tuned into that and the role of different media on driving brand trust?
I don't think anyone until recently has begun to tune into. I mean, I can see in the data that trust as an issue is a relatively novel one. Its role amongst objectives has surged in recent years. So I don't think anybody really was leaning into it. Everyone, at least for the last decade, has been obsessed with the short-term digital kind of agenda, getting those very powerful immediate ROI kind of spikes that everyone's looking for. And the eye has been off the brand ball, and the trust is inevitably the consequence of that we've started to lose trust in our brands. It didn't have to be that way, and it can't be that way in the future, because the brands will die if they do. So I think this is one of these phases. We've been led up a bit of a cul-de-sac for the last 10 years. We've realised the mistake. This kind of research is going to help us correct that. But I think we need to lean back into it. But I think above all, I would say is let's be very, very conscious and push back against anyone who suggests that trust is just a bit of wokery. You're going to get it. You're going to get a lot of people saying, oh, it's just some kind of airy-fairy, kind of nonsense. It really, really isn't. And I think you've got to stand your ground on this, because it has emerged very strongly as an issue, and it wasn't always, and I fully understand that, but it's become so, and I think we've just got to accept that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. We've got about 5 minutes left. Has anybody out there got a question for any of our panellists? Yes. Who wants to take that question?
I mean, from a consumer's perspective, what they say about trust, it's one of those things that sort of built up over years and can be evaporated in an instant. So, yeah, I think it's something you accrue over time, and I think it's something that, it's from repeated exposures and impressions over time. And I think that's where, all this stuff that Byron Sharp talks about, distinctive brand assets, consistency of a brand showing up, not chopping and changing your positioning or your campaign every 5 seconds. It's that. I think that's kind of really one of the things that underpins trust. And so, yeah, I don't think there are sort of shortcuts, short-term ways to do it, particularly for probably bigger brands. I think for younger brands, where people have a bit more of an open mind, they're not sure if they've got enough information to have the basis for trust. I think those ones can probably establish it a little bit more quickly. So I work a lot with a lot of scale-up brands. They sort of get to a point, they've got their kind of core users who are really into what they do. They build a great sort of strong community, but then they begin to plateau. And then to sort of cross across that chasm to get truly sort of mainstream acceptance. So, a brand like Huel, for example, it's a pretty radical concept for a lot of consumers to get their head round drinking a meal. For a brand like that to begin to sort of build and accrue trust, you can see why advertising in news brands could be a real good way of shortcutting and speeding up that process to gaining a bit more mainstream acceptance.
I think just an example of that. So cast your mind back to a point last year where the press around P&O ferries completely screwed our P&O Cruises client. Not related as companies at all, but sadly shared the two letters of P and O. And our immediate response was to go into news brands and to use print and digital news brands to really kind of not shy away from the fact that we needed to tell lots of people that we were a credible brand, that we had authority, and we definitely, whilst I wouldn't say the trust in the brand is back where it was, it's definitely ticking up in the right direction by just that kind of consistent, almost announcement, trust-based behaviour that we've seen really work.
Yeah, no, I'm just going to absolutely echo everything that's been said. It obviously, the short answer to the question is it depends why trust has fallen. If you're trying to correct some reputational issue, it's going to take you a long time. We know that the banks, after the global financial crisis, they were aided, of course, by the fact that they had a shitload of money in their back pockets that they could throw at the problem, which brands in other sectors probably wouldn't have. So it would have taken longer for brands in other sectors to rebuild trust. But they did manage it in the end, by and large. I think they have rebuilt trust, at least for the time being they have. We will see. Certainly echo what Andy said about young brands. If it's just due to an absence, we haven't brand built for many years, or we're new and we've never brand built, then it's a blank sheet, and it is much easier to build trust. You've just got to do the hard yards of brand building and you'll get there. But it can be quicker.
We've probably got time for one more question. If there are any out there, stick your hand up now. No more questions. Okay, I've got one more for each of you. So if you could very quickly and succinctly in one sentence, I suppose, give me your view on whether there's anything you've seen today which changes your perception of news brands? Kelly, I'm going to start with you because I suppose from a media planning perspective, it's got the same impact.
I don't think anything's changed. I would just say I love the fact that I've got more to reinforce it with clients. So
Yeah.
it's a great build on the body of work that we've
Yeah.
seen already.
Okay.
Not succinct, sorry.
Yeah.
For me, I thought Andy and Ian's lovely experiment where they exposed, same message on different platforms. That's confirmed. As I looked at my data, I thought, can this really be true? And, I needed that kind of experiment to make me feel 100% confident. So that was a great eye-opener for me.
Yeah, that was great. I mean, and it corroborates some work that we've done previously where we're looking at the same ads in different environments and how there is a very different outcome for that. So, yeah, I love that piece of the research that you presented today. Andy, one final word from you.
Yeah, I think it's the timing of it, and I think in Peter's data, the timing of seeing this sort of emergence of nonsense that we're sort of seeing that we're having to deal with, and people turning to trusted sources. So if we are in this trust vacuum, people have reliable, competent information sources to turn to inform themselves, so they don't have to take risks and have to try to act in the absence of trust. And it feels like news brands are really. I think the thing that surprised me was the extent to which they're seen in such a sort of powerful light. So yeah, it makes sense, and the impacts seem huge. And now I hope we understand sort of why we're seeing what we're seeing.